Let's talk Tanya for the 4th of Teves of a leap year. In today's Tanya, we begin chapter 5. We're in the middle of the larger discussion and exploration and understanding of the godly soul, the nefesh elikis, and we've made a lot of headway. In chapter 2, we learned about the substance of the godly soul, which is godliness. In chapter 3, we learned about the core components, the structure of the godly soul. The godly soul is comprised of these 10 faculties, 3 of them intellectual, 7 of them emotional. And then in the chapter that we just finished, chapter 4, we spoke about the agenda and what we call the garments or the tools and expressions of the godly soul, and they're connected with each other because the agenda of the godly soul is to connect to God. How does the godly soul connect to God? That is only through thought, speech, and action of Torah and mitzvahs. So the agenda of the godly soul is to connect to God through learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. That's what we have up until this point. And now we're going to start chapter 5, where the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us that yes, although the agenda of the godly soul is to study Torah and do mitzvahs and thereby to connect to God, there's something special. There's a special advantage to studying Torah over doing mitzvahs. The unity that can be achieved through studying and understanding Torah is greater than the unity that can be achieved through doing mitzvahs. Why is that? So Alter Rebbe talks about the nature of Torah. And for those of you familiar, especially with the Talmud, we know that a lot of the stuff that we learn about in the Talmud has very little relevance to our everyday lives. First of all, because you're learning about laws that might not be personally relevant to you. And moreover, it's very possible that some of the laws that we're learning perhaps never happened, never will happen. The example that Alter Rebbe gives is if you have a court case and party A comes to court and they argue such and such, and then party B counters and says, they have a different version of the events. So what is the halacha in this case? What is the law? Now, it's highly possible that this never happened. It never happened that there was a court case where one person came and argued as such, and the other person came and countered in the exact way described in the Talmud. And therefore, if we look at Torah only as a guide to life, the Torah is here to tell me what to do, which is true, by the way. That is definitely an important aspect of Torah. But if that's all that Torah is, then that was a waste of time just now. The Alter Rebbe says there's something much deeper going on over here, which is that halacha, the fact that when person A says X and person B says Y, the halacha, the final ruling is as such, that is God's wisdom and God's will. God's wisdom dictates and God's will desires that that's what the halacha should be. God is one with his wisdom and will. When I study that halacha, when I study that piece of Torah, and I therefore process and I'm ingesting that information, so that halacha, God's wisdom and God's will is becoming part of me. It's becoming one with me. And that is an incredible unity with God, which is why Jewish people, we learn Torah. We just always learn Torah. Not only, in other cultures, you have the scholars that learn Torah, the academics, and by us, it's not only the rabbis. We all study Torah because Torah is the most amazing means of connection with God, a unity with God which is unparalleled. Now, when I do a mitzvah, I'm also connecting with God. But when I'm doing a mitzvah, I'm so to say, I'm engaging God. I'm experiencing godliness. I am, at this moment, becoming subsumed in godliness. But ultimately, that godliness is not becoming part of me. In fact, when I do a mitzvah, I'm putting myself aside. I am becoming batel. I'm being nullified to God. I'm putting myself aside, doing what God wants, which therefore, at the moment when I'm doing the mitzvah, I'm experiencing God and uniting with God. But when I'm learning Torah, it's much more than engaging and experiencing God. I'm ingesting and processing God. Those ideas of the Torah, which is God's wisdom and will, are becoming part of me. They're becoming part of my knowledge base, part of my mind, part of my perspectives in life. And this is why in Kabbalah we're taught that mitzvahs are the garments of the soul and Torah is the mazain, is the nourishment, the sustenance, the food for the soul. Because Torah becomes part of me. Just like food, we eat food and it becomes part of our flesh and blood. We learn Torah, that godliness becomes part of who we are. Which is why when we're talking about the agenda of the godly soul, which is to unite with God, there is nothing greater and nothing higher than studying Torah, even more so than doing mitzvahs. Now, this does not mean that learning Torah is more important than doing mitzvahs. As we'll find out in later chapters in Tanya, chapters 36 and on, Ultimately, the reason why we were put down here in this world is to do mitzvahs. So mitzvahs are more important. But in terms of uniting with God, which is the greatest desire of the godly soul, there is absolutely nothing greater than studying Torah. So with this, we finished the agenda of the godly soul, uniting with God through doing mitzvahs, and even more so through learning Torah. We've concluded the topic of the godly soul, and now we need to find out who our opponent is. Now we need to engage in a little counterintelligence and learn a little more about the animal soul, because after all, if we're going to successfully struggle against the animal soul, we need to have a better understanding of it, and that we will start, God willing, in tomorrow's Tanya.